speaking of theology, you've touched upon this already a little bit, but can we think of a notion of Muslimness? I mean, you've spoken of a notion of whiteness, and this isn't necessarily your own notion per se, but you're drawing on other philosophers in discussing questions around whiteness. Can we speak of a notion of Muslimness, which, let's say, at the very least, right? I mean, I don't think it's only this, of course, right? But at the very least, if we take sort of the Edward Saadian understanding of Orientalism, the other that was created in the example of the Muslim other. So is Muslimness in a certain degree in the West, and again, I definitely do not want to reduce it to only that, playing the role of responding to Western pressures very often. To my mind, for example, post 9/11, there's been a lot of discussion amongst Muslims in the West, not least in Britain, but also in the US. I lived in the US for 10 years in New York, so I know a little bit about New York at this point. But Muslims really trying to kind of actively engage on a societal level, where perhaps previous generations that wasn't necessarily their concern per se. Anyway, I don't want to put words in your mouth.
So I think Muslimness, if I was thinking of the word Muslimness, I'm thinking of the attributes of being a Muslim, and those can either be self-defined, so my Muslimness as I define it, but I think the way in which you're suggesting it is the Muslimness, the perception of what it means to be a Muslim that is imposed upon us, and that would be very much linked to the idea of Orientalism, the idea that Edward Said, obviously, to whom we are much indebted, God rest his soul, that, the idea of the Muslim, the idea of the Oriental is formed in the Western imagination, and is in many ways completely disconnected from the reality of the Orient or the Oriental, which are actually the Orientals. So in brief, there is a perception of Muslimness which is created in public discourse around Islam, around Muslims, which is connected in many ways to the post 9/11 era, where Islam is still associated in many people's minds with violence, actually, is the truth. That's a very painful acknowledgement, I think, for me personally. I think for a long time I was part of the group of people, who were trying to fight back, and say, no, don't think that about us. It's not what Islam is about. And obviously that isn't what Islam is about, but it's, it's Toni Morrison who says that, the function of racism is distraction. They will have you, basically spending all this time digging up your history, measuring skulls, proving who you are. And in the meantime, you're missing out on the beauty of just living who you are. And so for me, that is a massive thing. That was a massive turning point for me, where I was like, actually, it's my job to live out my identity as a Muslim as best I see fit, and the most good I can do within this current conversation, where it's clear that people do absorb negative messaging around my faith, is to be a living embodiment that contradicts that perception, rather than trying to change them from up here. I don't debate this stuff anymore. I'm really not interested in just arguing with someone about whether is Islam a violent religion, what is the true meaning of jihad? Whatever you want to think, whatever you want to believe, you do you. I'm going to do me as best I can. And I just think that actually, if we all just focus on being, and I'm talking about us as Muslims here, on just trying to be the best version of Muslim that we can be, that in itself would be tidal change. Rather than being out here trying to focus on changing other people, be like, I'm going to expend all of that energy and trying to be the best version of myself. And that also shifts the mentality, in my view, from one which can be quite victimizing to like, oh my God, everyone hates us. I experience all of this, very real discrimination, which does exist, and it exists in the UK, but it exists even worse in my native country of France and in other parts of Europe and of course America too. But actually it's so much more empowering to, in the face of a situation that, although it must be structurally resisted, day to day you can't live in that space. You will just drive yourself insane. And so I just find it to be a healthier space to define Muslimness for myself and to try and live up to how I envisage that. And that's the best form of resistance for me to the imposition of a perception of Muslimness, which has a long history. I'm probably not going to change it overnight, but I can definitely through personal relationships, which therefore speak to the heart, connect with people at a human level, and through that, and them knowing that I'm Muslim, that will, I think, have a profound impact on how they think about those things.
And I definitely appreciate that perspective as far as the spiritual, to use that problematic term again, as far as the spiritual life is concerned. At the same time, with due respect, there's the power of the Orientalist narrative. And again, I'm really not interested in, because I did that a lot in the past, and I'm a graduate of Columbia postcolonial studies. It's like one of the major centers of postcolonial literature.
Said studied there, right? Yeah,
Said taught there. He was a university professor, etc., etc.
Mahmoud Mamdani,
they're all there. All the big names are there. So I was immersed in that for some time. So I'm not, but I'm kind of over that, to be honest. At the same time, it has to be said that the nature of the discourse, right, from a Foucauldian point of view, is Foucauldian sense, is such that the Orientalist discourse is very powerful, to the point where someone like Roxanne Euban, brilliant scholar of Islam, she wrote what I would say is one of the best in sort of most intelligent sort of analyses of Islamic sort of major Islamic political thinkers. She teaches, where does she teach anyway? But she makes the point in her book Enemy in the Mirror that the Orientalist tropes get created in Orientalist sort of centers of learning, right, and knowledge production, and then they get exported throughout the world. And then Muslims themselves, academics, putting aside everyday people, academics themselves, scholars of Islam, trying to make sense of what is this religion that we have in relation to modernity, in relation to the West, etc., etc. They end up adopting the very tropes all too often. So it functions at a very deep level. I'm not so sure that we can. I respect and certainly appreciate the sort of spiritual attitude that you describe, which is its own thing, as it were. From a theoretical point of view, I'm not sure how much we can disentangle ourselves from the wider narratives. It's very hard. I don't think it's impossible, but it's very hard. And maybe this is part and parcel of the human project and experience. We are always, maybe life is just not meant to be super comfortable. Because as it turns out, from evolutionary theory, from an evolutionary theoretical point of view, evolutionary sociological point of view, right, we're actually hardwired to want to, we don't want suffering, but we thrive under certain pressures. Like if things are too easy, like one of the reasons why this is a huge problem in the West, but not just in the West, amongst affluent sort of classes throughout the world now. Huge issues with drug addiction and depression and suicide because things are too easy. So maybe in a way it's not all bad, but anyway.
I don't know if I'd agree that it's because it's too easy. I think disconnection is a huge part of that picture. You know, that material wealth doesn't guarantee what constitutes the social wealth, which is the quality of your interconnectedness with other humans primarily, but also I would argue with nature and the natural world. And actually a lot of materially wealthy nations, the flip side of urbanization, the flip side of, you know, the creation of huge sprawling megalopolises has been the complete erasure of the, I would call the sort of, well, it's the natural world, but with it the reminders that connects us to a bigger picture, to a higher power. And that connection, but also the connection to other people, is what, you know, and there are studies in this that, you know, show that the quality of your relationships determines the level of happiness in your life. I mean, that's a real thing. So but to your question, you know, knowledge is never produced in a vacuum. And so I think the best academics are always those who are theorizing with a real awareness of the wider cultural and political environment in which they are theorizing, and that they try as best they can to account for that, you know. But ultimately, and if we're going to look specifically at the production of knowledge within institutions, you know, those institutions are funded, and a lot of that funding is dependent on output, and output is measured through the extent to which that knowledge is of value to policy. And so when you start to connect the dots, then it's clear that you will see a lot of money, for example, pumped into, you know, radicalization, anti-radicalization, so that, you know, we get back to the picture that Said describes so beautifully in Orientalism, which is, you know, and I love to tell this story of the man who goes to who comes across the lion, right? And you know, he comes across the lion, and his encounter with the lion, having just tread into its den, is that the lion attacks him. And so he goes back and he writes this extended piece about the ferociousness of lions. And so the next adventurer who comes across his work is like, oh my God, ferocious lions. Let me go and study the ferociousness of lions. And before we know it, we have an entire corpus around the ferociousness of lions, and how, you know, their teeth are jagged, and, you know, their claws, and how dangerous they are. And actually, a lot of the time, lions are quite indolent, they're quite passive, they're really nurturing to their young, they're very affectionate. Like, there's a whole facet of what it means to be a lion that goes completely ignored, because the one interaction that created the premise of the corpus of knowledge that was subsequently created was a conflictual one. That is the story of the West's engagement with the Orient. And as Muslims, we are, you know, as Muslims in the West, we are just in many ways like the byproducts of that initial engagement, which has just been built upon and continues to be built upon. But we're also, you know, living with the reality of very decontextualized understandings of geopolitics. You know, the idea that ISIS, for example, are this, you know, complete sort of I almost want to say like nihilistically violent group that emerged, you know, kind of almost out of nowhere. They're just like super violent Muslims that came out of like the Middle East. Okay, I mean, where do we start? There's obviously, you know, the Iraq War, you know, millions of people die and millions of people are maimed, and a country that was once, one of the most highly educated, a very broad middle class, people would go and study in Iraq. I mean, Iraq was this huge center of learning for us as Muslims historically, and until, very recently, albeit that it continued in the post-colonial era to be ruled by highly repressive leaders who were by and large more responsive to external acquiescence than to that of their people. Somewhere where there was a level of material comfort for a lot of people. I mean, you cannot compare Iraq today, Syria today. I mean, for anyone who actually traveled to Syria prior to, the so-called civil war, there will be a whole generation of people who will only know Iraq, who will only know Syria as like these bombed desert lands. And, that is a very skewed picture of the region. And it's a very skewed picture of history. And if that's all you know, then your assumption is that the people that come out of that are just these sort of barbaric people who've come from violence. And there's no conversation around, so I'm a huge fan of Fanon, Fanon, the Martinican psychiatrist, and his ideas around violence. And I think that there is, as a Muslim, I think that everything in our faith says violence is absolutely a last resort. Like every enjoyment that we have basically seeks mediation and ways to avoid ever confronting, ever arriving at violence as a solution. But that's the faith. People are not walking embodiments of Islamic theology. People are products of having their homes bombed, of having been tortured, of losing their families, of having seen people maimed and die. People are the product of the trauma in which they have grown up. And if you want to talk about trauma, you want to go talk about the generation of people who have grown up in the region, in the post-Iraq war shadow, because there is a lot of ongoing trauma. And so, hurt people. Okay, it sounds like a really obvious cliche, but actually it's literally what happens. If you hurt people on a massive scale and you give them very little sense of rehabilitation, of accountability of those who have caused that harm, and if that harm appears to have no ending in sight, then you will create a people who believe that violence is the only response to that. And that has very little to do with their faith, actually. I understand that people have tried to impose a sort of theological justification on, the extreme acts of violence that people like ISIS have enacted. But I see very little that I can understand within that, outside of it being a product of the trauma of the region. If you haven't lived through that trauma, the theological, in very inverted brackets, justifications for like burning people alive, for like, enslaving people, for raping young women, like there is none. I mean, you can try, but I just don't think that's where the conversation is. It's a useful way of distracting the conversation away from the geopolitics, which is a lot of a messier conversation, onto a very essentializing one, which is ultimately, we have known since our first interaction with Islam that this is a violent, barbaric religion. Oh, that little trope easily crops, back into the picture. But ultimately, that I don't know that, and I genuinely say this because if I did, I would say it. I genuinely don't think this is a theological conversation. I understand that there are theological arguments, but they are not theological arguments that have any weight with 99.98% of the Muslims in the world. So how are we sort of portraying it as if this is where the conversation's at?
Right, and I think if people want to, and people, whether Muslim or otherwise, right, we're endlessly inventive, right, and creative, and we're going to find excuses for
bad behavior,
for actions, good and bad, right? We're always going to find justifications for it. So if someone is a certain way, is, you know, and look, how easy for me to say, right? I have long hair. I'm kind of like a bit of a hippie living in the UK. I have a PhD, multiple degrees. Like, how easy for me to say to, of course, I do not believe in violence as a solution for anything. But, you know, if people are growing up and living and all they've known is violence, then I imagine, to echo some of the things you've been saying, it's pretty hard for someone to think outside of a framework of violence, because what's the incentive? Like to even be able to think clearly requires having basic needs met, like really literally to be able to think as a human being almost, right?
Yeah. And, you know, that's where Fanon would say that the violence of the colonized is a reflection of the violence of the colonizer. And so that applied just as much during the colonial era as I think it does subsequently. You know, people...
of course, Fanon, who, and for those who may not know, deeply influential, brilliant post-colonial thinker, from Martinique. He did his studies in France, experienced serious racism in France, was a medical doctor, psychiatrist, if I'm not mistaken. He worked in Algeria, so he saw firsthand, and this is during
the Algerian War of Independence.
During the Algerian War of Independence, so he saw some awful things done to native Algerian populations by the colonizing French forces. And I mean, his insights, and interestingly enough, I mean, I'm always, I mean, it doesn't surprise me anymore, but it kind of, there's a number of years ago where I was like, oh, wait a minute, Fanon was writing, he wasn't writing as an academic, which is, I mean, he was brilliant.
Yeah.
You know, he had the best schooling available at the time, but he wasn't writing as an academic for academics. He was writing as a person amongst the people for the people, and which is why, as far as I'm concerned, his writings still have so much power. I mean, when I first read Black Skins, White Masks, it completely blew me away many years ago now.
Fanon was very, very highly invested morally and otherwise in the Algerian War of Independence. He was not an academic on the sidelines, kind of observing it and intellectualizing it for some paper he had to submit, or
for some university job which, you know, pays his kind of thing.
He was in Algeria, Algeria, and he was a witness to some of what we know to be the extreme forms of violence that were inflicted on the Algerian population by the French colonial powers at the time, you know.